Thanks for joining us. This broadcast is in conjunction with Independence Live and CommonSpace. My name is Jen Stout, and tonight I'm interviewing Andrew Stoddart, who's a tenant farmer from East Lothian. So you were recently the subject of a bit of a media storm, I think, in the space of just a couple of weeks. Your story was all over the Times and the Guardian and CommonSpace as well, of course. And this wasn't just a flash in the pan, but this was the culmination of a long battle that you'd been having, and you were being threatened with eviction on the 28th of November. This is the 3rd of December. You haven't been evicted yet. So do you want to tell us briefly what happened to cause that big storm and where we're at now?
Well, we were served with a notice to get out due to a land court order which was obtained late last year, and it was due to take effect as of Saturday there. But there was I decided to go public about it in August because the pressure I was under was so severe, and the landlord was being very difficult. So we decided to go public, and we've just had such enormous support, and we've managed to negotiate a slightly longer period to get out of the farm, which is obviously not what we want, but it's the best we can get under the circumstances.
Mm-hmm. So you now have until when?
Until the end of January.
To the end of January. And one of the issues was that you'd been working this farm for 22 years, is that right?
That's right, yeah. We started on the farm in August 1993, and we had lots to do. The place was very, very run down. It hadn't had anything done to it in a long time.
So you were telling me about the situation you found yourself in a couple of months ago when your eviction date was set for the 28th of November. At that point, I know that there have been other tenant farmers who have been in this situation, who are in this situation. Did you really have much hope that things would change? Did you envisage that you'd have a petition with 20,000 people signing it, you know?
Oh, absolutely not. I had no idea that would happen or even could happen.
Mm-hmm.
It just was one of these things that just somebody decided to start the petition. Michelle Wood just off her own back, and all of a sudden it just took off, and I couldn't believe it.
Mm-hmm. And Michelle had been a neighbour of yours, is that right?
Yes, she'd helped us at the lambing once, and we did know her, and she's been great.
Mm-hmm. And what was it like to be in the middle of that kind of media storm, you know, with people coming to interview on the farm and the newspapers everywhere about it? What was that like?
Well, it was highly stressful.
Yeah.
In some ways, it was great also to be able to tell the story and get the a problem shared is a problem half, they say. So if you're sharing it with thousands of people, it fairly helps.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And the response from the estate was to say that this was the whole situation was due to defective legislation. Can you tell us about that a bit?
Well, the legislation was found to be defective. I don't believe it was defective, but we believed we had been given a full tenancy in 2003, and we acted on that basis, and we actually thought that we had some rights, that we could ask for a rent review, and we could ask the landlord to you have no rights as a tenant, you've just got to do as you're told. Mm-hmm. And it wasn't until 2003 that the law was changed, and we thought that we had a secure lease, that we could actually ask for the things that had been promised. And so we asked for a rent review and various other things that should have been done that weren't. And that developed into a bit of an argument which rumbled on for years.
Yeah.
And we were misled by the government legislation into believing we were secure, which led us to act in a certain way which we wouldn't otherwise have done.
Mm-hmm.
And then in 2012, when the legislation was overturned in this Court of Session, it was pretty devastating to realise that all the work we put into the farm was going to be for nothing, and we'd probably be put out.
Mm-hmm. So now you're in the situation where you have until January, a sort of reprieve that has come out of negotiations.
Yeah.
What will happen in January?
Well, at the end of January we'll have to go, and our 2 men will be made redundant, and unless they can find other jobs, and we'll all have to leave the farm. Mm-hmm. All 3 families will have to leave. In fact, they have left already because the council have managed to find them houses.
Right.
And the reprieve was only given 3 days before the date we were supposed to be out, so there was no way that we could have organised anything different.
Yeah. Despite the pressure, and the public awareness for months, that was literally days before.
Yeah.
There was a demonstration and the petition was handed in, and it was only literally days before that you got to have any news of this. So.
Absolutely, and we had a mediation at the very last minute, although it had been promised 2 years earlier by the government, so it's not really possible to have a good mediation 3 days before your eviction date.
Mm-hmm. So the land reform bill is coming up and something very strange happened in October at the SNP conference, where the party leadership were, I think, surprised when their membership rejected their land reform bill effectively and sent it back to think again. And there was 2 things that the SNP members who proposed rejecting it mentioned, and one of them was your situation. And they said, we can't tolerate this situation happening to more people, and if your land reform bill can't fix this, then we want you to go back and bring us something more radical. And you spoke at a fringe meeting after that event in Aberdeen to, I think, hundreds of SNP members, and the impression I got when I was there was that they were shocked to hear of your situation.
Yeah, I mean, I was standing on that stage and looking at 300 open mouths at the situation I was describing. The work I'd put into the farm and the money and the way we'd improved it. Because being a young tenant farmer, it's like, you imagine if you were a bus driver turning up to drive a bus on your first day, and you open the bonnet of the bus to discover that there's no engine in it. So you have to go and get a new engine and stick and fit it to the bus before you can actually earn any money. Mm-hmm. So then you go and earn some money, and then when the contract's finished, they say, right, off you go, and by the way, that bus is now ours. Mm-hmm. You see, and really that's how tenant farming works. The law is hopeless regarding tenants' improvements. Mm-hmm. There's so many ways out of it that it's impossible to get true value for what you've put in.
And this has been, as I said, an issue that's been raised for many, many years in the Scottish Parliament. So did you expect something more helpful for you and other people in your situation to be in the land reform bill, which supposedly included all of the agricultural holdings that had gone before? Do you feel it was disappointing, or do you think it's still got provisions in it that will be helpful?
Well, we were very, very disappointed in the bill, because the things that were discussed in the run-up in all the consultations all disappeared from the bill. Mm-hmm. I mean, Richard Lochhead said there would be a right to buy in it, and then there was talk of being able to assign your tenancy, and both these provisions disappeared. Mm-hmm. Which left the bill really, in my view, meaningless. Yeah. And the right to buy, which is proposed for sustainable development, looks to me just like a lawyer's feast.
Yeah. And how does that compare with other with tenant farmers in other countries. They enjoy the right to buy in various European countries, don't they?
Yeah, well, the Irish got the right to buy about 100 years ago, but even before that, they had the right to remain on the land. They could never be put off, and the rents were controlled. What tenants need is absolute security and rent control. The one's no use without the other, because if you don't have security, you can't get your rent reduced.
Yeah.
And it's no use having security of tenure if the rent just gets jacked up till you can't pay it anymore. And we've seen instances recently where tenant rents are being doubled, and tenants either have two choices. They either give up the farm, or they pay this ridiculous rent and hope for the best, but they probably end up going bust.
And has that been happening recently in particular, with the Land Reform Bill coming up? The Scottish Tenant Farmers Association said that they've been very concerned that landlords are taking this chance, weak as the bill's provisions might be, they're taking this chance to put in more rent hikes before that comes into play. Do you think that's a fair statement?
Yes, that's right. There's no doubt there is a bit of that. However, these increases have been going on for some years.
And at the same time, the wider situation with tenant farming, since 1982, I think the amount of agricultural tenanted land in Scotland has decreased by 44%, and it's now one of the lowest in Europe, according to the Scottish Parliament briefing. What is driving that, and do you think that is going to continue? And if so, what's the future for tenant farmers in Scotland?
Well, the reduction in tenanted land is driven by a number of factors. The tax incentives for landlords to not to let it are very good, and then there are some tenants who have bought their farms, which is a good result. And there's a huge move to contract farming, which is, it's a desperate thing that's happening, where a tenant like myself will be put out of the farm, and a contract farmer will be brought in, and the landlord will become the farmer, and he will then collect the subsidy. And this is a major factor in the reduction of tenanted land, is that area-based subsidies are the death of the tenant farmer, because the landlord just puts the tenant out and collects them himself.
And was that ever going to be addressed by the long process of agricultural holdings review?
No, I mean the Ag Holdings Bill will not change that unless it changes the ability of landlords to put tenants out. In France, for example, land is generally let for a 9-year period, but there is a presumption that the tenant will stay on the farm and have a new lease, unless the landlord has a very good reason for putting them out. And in this country, you don't need any reason to put somebody out. You just say that's it, you're gone. And it's the same as in a flat or a house, a rented house. The landlord currently in this country needs no reason to put you out of the property.
No fault eviction.
Yeah, which is wrong.
But not so with crofters. Why do you think that is?
Well, excuse me, I'll have a drink.
Yeah.
Crofters have everything. They have security of tenure, they have rent control, they even can buy their properties if they so choose, and they can never ever be put out from them. And I believe that act was supposed to cover the whole of Scotland, but the House of Lords managed to restrict it just to the crofting counties.
I think you're right. Yeah.
And they weren't seen as crofting counties then, because crofting existed all over Scotland. But the House of Lords stopped that act in its tracks, and unfortunately that is a great shame.
Yeah. The interesting thing with that period as well is that there was a real struggle. There was a fight and the Battle of the Braes and things like that. How do you think that affected that situation? Is that a factor?
Well, absolutely. I mean, the Napier Commission was a fairly toothless document, I believe, much like the documents that came out of the Ag Holdings Review Group.
Yeah.
And it didn't have very much provision for the crofters at all, but it was only after the Battle of the Braes and the rent strikes and things that that a stronger bill was put forward by Gladstone, I believe.
Yeah, interesting, because the Liberal Democrats seem to have forgotten their land reform roots, in a sense.
Absolutely. We've forgotten a lot of things.
I mean, the political landscape in Scotland is obviously quite interesting at the moment and changing very quickly. But the SNP have now decided they're the party of land reform. That wasn't always the case, was it? Or was it?
Well, the SNP have always had a strong stance on land reform. I think. I mean, but that seems to have possibly waned in the last few years.
And why do you think that is? The weakness of this bill. What's the major factors involved in that from your perspective?
Well, I just wish I knew. I mean, I attended the Parliament in 2003 when the 2003 Land Reform Act was being debated, and Fergus Ewing, for instance, made a passionate speech that tenants should be able to buy their farms. And it was a fantastic speech, and if any of the Labour MSPs had bothered to listen to it, I'm sure they would have voted for it, but unfortunately it wasn't passed. And if it had been passed, well, we wouldn't be sitting here today.
Yeah.
But that was the view then, and Richard Lochhead and all the other SNP members were very much for land reform then.
We've seen, I suppose, the public support that you got when you were threatened with eviction, and the public support, I think, for land reform generally. Does that make you more optimistic about the prospect of things actually changing for the better?
Yes, I'm. Excuse me, that chair's squeaking. I'm more optimistic now than before that things might change in the bill, or in another bill that's coming later. And a lot of people are saying that there's a limited time to deal with this bill, which may inhibit changing much of it. But we do hope that there may be some changes.
How much do you think the progress is being restricted by legal fears of Scottish Government lawyers, particularly after some court rulings around property rights and trumping other rights? Do you think that's a factor?
Well, it's a huge factor. I think the lawyers seem to be running the show, and no one seems to be willing to take risks, which is a great shame. And the human rights thing needs to be examined in a much broader context than just from the landlord's point of view. Because other people have rights too. Yeah,
the interpretation of property rights as a sort of absolute is an odd one, because that doesn't exist in the European legislation that people refer to quite a lot. But there does seem to be a timidness in the Parliament.
Yeah, well, the thing is in Europe that they do not have the concentrated patterns of land ownership that we have, due to their different history.
Yeah. And
this Human Rights Act I don't think was ever designed to protect estates of 100,000 acres or more.
What would you say to the frequent allegations you hear in the land reform debate that this is the politics of envy? This is greed and sort of pitchfork politics?
Well, it's a load of nonsense. You only have to drive around the country and you can see some of the parts of the country where the place is really run down, and you can almost be sure that will be a large estate where all these properties are being allowed to decay.
Mm-hmm. Are you talking about the lowlands or the highlands or both?
Well, anywhere.
Yeah.
And it could be in Ayrshire, it could be in Fife, it could be anywhere, or away in the Highlands.
Mm-hmm. We've actually been sent in a question by Mike, who wants to ask if you can explain a bit more how the issue of land subsidies is playing into what's happening for you and for other farmers in Scotland at the moment.
Well, the subsidy issue is a massive issue. There's been a massive amount of land taken back in hand this year because of the change in the subsidy regime. Mm. And my tenancy is just the latest example of a grab for subsidy, which if that was not an issue, I don't think it would be happening. Mm-hmm. Because the subsidy regime has changed this year. For example, 5 years ago, if I had been put out of the farm, the landlord could not have claimed the subsidy the following year. Mm-hmm. But now, thanks to the change, he can.
Which change is that then?
Well, the new CAP regime came in this year, and it allows now for a tenant to be put out of the farm and the landlord to claim it the following year.
Right. Mike also asks, is the farming sector essentially going through the same process that other sectors have been through, like agency 0 hours employment issues? Could you make an analogy there?
Well, that's an absolute fact. If you look at the 0 hours problem with employment, where the worker is guaranteed only 0 hours, so he is living on a very insecure life. Mm-hmm. And this is mirrored exactly by farming and the shift to contract farming, where essentially you are farming land, but you have no tenancy. You are a contractor, and the contract can be ended almost at will.
And presumably that's more profitable for the owners of the land involved.
Oh, absolutely.
Mm-hmm.
But again, it's tied back to the subsidy. If they weren't getting the subsidy, they probably wouldn't be doing it. But it gives them a comfort that they have this money, and as long as the contracting doesn't lose too much money, they're happy enough. Mm-hmm. But it's very difficult for anyone to be a contract farmer because of this lack of security. For example, the bank would never entertain you. So what you find is that contract farming is generally entered into by someone who already owns another farm.
Okay.
It's not something that a young person with no capital would go into.
And unless things change, is that going to be the dominant pattern in the next few decades for farms in Scotland?
Oh, absolutely. It's been on the go now for probably about 10 years. The contract farming has really taken off.
What happens to what would happen to your house that you live in with your partner and your children when you leave?
Well, these houses, there's 3 houses that my 2 workers and I lived in, and they will now be, I expect, renovated and turned into and let to commuters on short tenancies. So
you're in quite an expensive area for housing, aren't you, around Haddington?
Yes, it is very expensive now. Mm-hmm. A cottage rent now is £800 a month.
Right.
Which is a lot of money.
Yeah. That kind of leads us to another question that we had on Twitter, which from Hazel, who was asking, will you start again?
Well, I would hope so. Mm-hmm. not quite sure where or how, but we will start again somehow. And in what form, I don't know. There's various possibilities, like becoming a farm manager or some other form of employment, and maybe part-time farming.
Yeah. Was there anything else you wanted to add?
I've got a question for you. Hello. Mike Edwards, I wonder if there are others being impacted on by these issues that are scared to speak out?
Absolutely, there are. I know of lots of other farmers who are losing their farms as we speak, or who will lose them soon, who are being subjected to big rent reviews, but they won't speak out because they are still dependent in some way on their landlord, and they dare not fall out with them even worse than they are.
So I've heard of situations where, you know, there's one person or trust or something who is landlord, employer, and maybe local representative or political representative. There's a concentration of power, it seems, still held in the hands of very few, not just in terms of land ownership, but in terms of other forms of power. Do you think that's how widespread is that situation still? You know, we abolished feudalism in Scotland in 2003, but it seems that I hear so many stories that could really generally be described as socially anyway feudal, if not legally.
Well, that's right. I mean, you have areas, maybe not so much where I am, but in perhaps in the Highlands or in the West, where you have a whole island, for instance, which is owned by one person, and if you have an argument with that estate, then I mean you can kiss goodbye to any grazings or an extra cottage or anything that you might want to enhance your life and build your business. And in the Lothians, for example, there's a massive concentration of estate agents, where we've seen Savills have taken over Smithsgore, and Smithsgore now control a massive amount of the Lothians regarding land, housing, and so on.
So, in that context, what would you say to the allegations that are often made in the press, especially, that the land reform movement and the push for land reform in Scotland is really about the politics of envy?
Well, I don't agree with that at all. It's just about bringing Scotland forward a couple of centuries. You know, we are, in the last 30 years, we have gone back the way, you know, in the 70s, you know, it was impossible to be put out of your farm. It was impossible to be put out of your house. Now, we have the exact opposite, and it's going back towards the Victorian era, where people could be just put out of their houses and farms like cattle, and the rents were astronomical. And we're exactly back there again. And I mean, in the Victorian era, it became so bad that land was abandoned, and Britain nearly came to starvation in the First World War. And you know, you don't want to see a thing like that happening again. In
fact, the farm that you've been on for 22 years actually has a very similar story from the 1800s, doesn't it, of what's happened to you?
Yeah, that's right. There was in the 100 years before 1900, there was 8 different tenants in my farm, most of whom did not leave voluntarily. They were chucked out, and not in good circumstances. Yeah.
It's history repeating itself in a terrible way.
Well, it is in some ways, yes.
And this really kind of, it's the talk of Scotland being this progressive modern nation, it rings a little bit hollow when this is going on all over the country. Do you think?
Absolutely. It's well, social justice is a word that I hear a lot coming from the government, and I just ask, well, where is it? When's it coming?
Yeah.
And it's not good for farmers, it's not good for the farm workers, it's not good for anyone.
Well, we're sitting here on the 3rd of December, which is the eve of the first stage committee report back on the land reform bill, on Scotland's specific land reform bill. The next few months, I suppose, will see amendments and campaigns and debates within the Parliament. How hopeful are you of meaningful change coming out of this, and to what extent is this going to have to be a very long process?
Well, it can't be that long because there's an election coming, so there is a limited time.
I suppose land reform as being a sort of generational thing and needing to have more bills each Parliament, the way that I think Andy Whiteman has suggested.
Yeah, well, there's talk there's going to be a land commissioner, and this is going to be an ongoing process, which will be great as long as they get a move on. But there's a massive problem in Scotland with the concentrated pattern of land ownership, and it needs to be tackled. And there's an obvious way of doing that, of giving tenants the right to buy their farms. I must emphasise buy them and not steal them, because that's always what's cast up, that they're going to steal them, which is absolutely not the case.
Where does that allegation come from?
Well, we all know it.
There's the rhetoric around, since the land reform thing really took off, I think last year, the rhetoric from the anti-land reform camp has been quite extraordinary, with sort of Mugabe land grab accusations. It seems that they're missing a fundamental kind of. There's an issue of democracy around this. People are wanting a democratisation of the land as well as of the economy, of the government. But this is the bill we have, and I guess what I was asking was how hopeful you are of progress in the next few months, of amendments being put onto this bill, and also what you think people can do to help that process and make it more radical, and what people can do to help you.
Well, they need to keep up the pressure on their MSPs and make sure that the bill is meaningful, as was called for at the conference, to make it a radical land reform bill. Even small things like if the tenant was allowed to buy his house and buildings in, say, 50 acres, which in many cases they've built the buildings anyway, and that would alter their outlook drastically, and it would help tremendously. And then things like the rent, the rent must be controlled, and then the other question is about leases that are on a time limit. The tenant who's sitting there must have a presumption of staying, unless there is some very good reason not to.
So these, for people at home, there is a petition around the land reform bill on 38 Degrees, as well as Andrew's petition, which is still collecting signatures. It's over 20,000 now. The land reform petition has several different demands. It's from the Our Land campaign, and people can find that online and follow proceedings in the next few months, which I think will be very interesting and exciting, but sadly too late to help you and your family at this point.
Yeah, it's going to be too late for us, but if other people can benefit, well, that'll be something.
Okay, thank you, Andrew.
Thank you very much.